Hello, welcome to All Things Apologetics. Sorry, hold on one second. I'm so happy you're here. Today we have a very special guest, Dr. Harold Felder. I met him at the seminary, Southern Evangelical Seminary, where we both studied. He is a former atheist and a NASA software engineer. So after becoming a believer and being exposed to the truth of Christianity, he's dedicated his life to sharing that truth with others. So he has an undergraduate degree in computer science and then both a master and doctorate of ministry degree in apologetics from Southern Evangelical Seminary. And he is the author of multiple articles in scholarly journals on race and the Bible. And Dr. Felder is also the author of the book, The African American Guide to the Bible. So he also serves as the dean of the New Beginnings Bible Institute in Charlotte, North Carolina. So thank you so much for being here today. If you wouldn't mind, leave a like and share this link so we can hopefully reach more people. And if you would like to also let us know where you're tuning in from, that would be awesome. And I will call Harold here in 1 minute. Sorry, hold on 1 second. All right. All right. Hi, Harold.
Hey, how you doing, Ethan?
Doing all right. How are you?
Doing very well today. I feel rejuvenated.
Awesome. You had the day off today, right?
Yes, I have a day off today.
Awesome. So glad you could be here. So we met at Southern Evangelical Seminary. I believe we may have had some classes together, or did we meet over peanut butter and jelly at break?
We may have met at the events, or it may have been a class. When did you attend?
So I was there from 2006 to 2011, doing my undergrad and grad, and you were there doing your master's and PhD, correct?
Yes. So, well, my doctorate in ministry. So we probably were taking the same classes while I was working on my doctorate.
Okay. Awesome. So let me see here who we have with us today. Hello, Thomas. How are you? Thank you for joining us. And we also have
shout out to Tom Melody.
So where's Thomas from? He's from here?
I know exactly where he's from.
You know where he's from. Awesome. And we have my friend Debs tuning in from Nairobi. Welcome, Debs. So great to have you here.
Cool.
All right. So I wanted to first ask you, if you wouldn't mind sharing, like, where are you from, Harold?
I was born and raised in Washington, D.C.
Oh, that's right.
Okay. That is where I lived most of my life until I joined the Navy. And then once I got the Navy, I went back to school, went to the University of Maryland, got my undergraduate in computer science, got the calling of the Lord, and decided to move to Charlotte, North Carolina to Southern Evangelical Seminary. And I have no desire to go back. I'm good here in Charlotte. I actually like Charlotte. So.
Yeah, I love Charlotte. So great. And how did you come to Christ? I know you have a book coming out on this topic, right? Sounds
actually, it's already written. I'm just trying to get it published. But actually, what happened was I grew up in a home that went to church on Sundays. Well, I said they sent me to church and my brother to church on Sunday, and it was a Christian church, Baptist church. But I didn't really pay any attention to what was going on there. You know, I went there to, cause trouble, hang out with other kids, and chase little girls around and everything but listening to the word. So I would say that I was a deist.
Okay.
And it got to a point where I decided to join the Navy. After hanging out and getting involved with the wrong crowd and getting involved in drugs and alcohol and all that type of stuff, I decided to join the Navy. And my first duty station was the Philippines. And I remember this very clearly. I could tell you it was March 3rd, 1982. And I remember this because it was my first day going out. into the city of Olangapo, which was the city outside of the Subic Naval Base. And I remember looking around and seeing all the beautiful women and seeing all the bars. And I actually made a conscious decision right then and there to become an atheist, to no longer believe in God, because I didn't want to be held accountable to any standard outside of myself.
Gotcha.
And I am confident that when I said that God in heaven was saying, thy will be done. Because God turned me over to my desires. I wanted women. I wanted to drink. And those two things became my God. Those are the two things that I longed for. Those are the two things I pursued. Those are the two things I thought about when I woke up in the morning. Those are the two things that dominated my life. And I fell deeper and deeper into that. Now, at the time, I probably would have, thought that I was having a great time. I did not realize that I was in bondage to the things that I wanted to be free to do. Got out the military, became more of an alcoholic. Because at least in the military, I would go out to sea for a while. I would go out to sea and be away from alcohol. And that brings up a very interesting point. Because during this time, as an atheist, the only time I struggled with my atheism was when I went out to sea. Because when I would look up at the stars at night, now I don't know if you've ever been out at sea, out in the middle of nowhere where there's no light contamination, but you can literally see billions of stars in the sky. And I remember just looking up and seeing all those stars and that just immense depth and just the incredible sense of awe. And I knew that there had to be a God, but I had to suppress that. So every time I would go back to shore, I would drink more, I would sleep with more women, whatever I could do in order to reinforce my atheism. But it was a still nagging thing in the back of my mind. It was still nagging that there had to be something greater that created the sea and all the life in it, that created the universe with all the billions of stars. It had to be. Pookie didn't do that. No man did that. Eventually, one day, my uncle came to me, and it was 4th of July. I remember this very clearly. And this was back in oh my goodness, I hate to say dates because I get them all confused. They all start to run together. But I believe it was 98. Okay. And I remember him saying, "Hey, there's this girl I want to introduce you to. Now, she's a Christian now, but in about 6 months, she won't be a Christian anymore. And then you're in a prime spot." And I thought she was very attractive. And so it made complete sense to me. So I started spending time with her. But what I did not count on was that she was the first Christian to ever talk the talk and walk the walk. And I was able to observe her life up close and personal because we did spend a lot of time together. Now we were, we weren't having a relationship. On further reflection, she was sort of mentoring me, but I hung out with her because I was physically attracted to her. That's the bottom line. But one day she invited me to go to church with her. It was a Friday, and I remember that because I remember thinking to myself, "Who in the world goes to church on a Friday? You go to happy hour on a Friday. You don't go to church on a Friday." But I went because she was still attractive. And something happened to me at that service. I felt the Holy Spirit move on me. I resisted it. But I eventually gave in. On the ride back, I told her what happened, gave my life to the Lord. And I became a follower of Jesus Christ. And one of the things that sort of struck me right away was, I was feeling great. Now, at this time, I'm a software engineer at NASA. I got my computer science degree. I'm a software engineer at NASA. So I'm a logical thinker. But what happened is that after the euphoria wore off, I was like, well, is this really real? Did I just get caught up in emotion? Is this stuff based in evidence? Is it logical? So I decided to do research to determine whether or not this new faith of mine, Christianity, was actually rooted in something other than emotion. And I was shocked and surprised to find out all the evidence for Christianity. I was sort of mad as well, because I couldn't believe that all the times that I would have these debates and arguments with Christians, and no one ever brought this evidence up to me. Wow. So I decided to just dedicate my life to sharing that evidence with other people. And so that is why, because as I was doing my research, of course, I kept coming across this name, Norman Geisler. And so I was listening to the Bible Answer Man one day, and I remember he had Dr. Geisler on as a guest, and I remember him saying, I'm starting this school in Charlotte, North Carolina. And when I heard that, I knew at some point I was going to end up in Charlotte, North Carolina, which I actually eventually did. Uh-huh. And I guess sort of the rest is history. I started my own ministry when I was down here, got involved with, I even pastored for a minute. And and so that is what brought me here. That is the genesis of that's my testimony in a nutshell.
Okay. Oh, that's awesome.
Maybe it wasn't a very small nutshell.
No, the book sounds so exciting, because you said it's going to be like, it's a conversational, kind of like Peter Kraft style. Yeah, definitely let me know when that comes out.
Yes, I will.
Okay, awesome. So we have 4 people watching. If you'd like to let us know where you're tuning in from and start thinking of questions. I talked to Harold beforehand. He said, cool, Matt Graham just joined us. As questions come up, feel free to shout them out, and we can all ask Harold all our hardest questions here. So so far we've just talked. I'm telling Matt here, we just heard about how Harold came to Christ and how you got into apologetics a little bit. What about the topic, how did you get into researching, is Christianity a white man's religion? I remember about 2 years ago, was it 2 years ago, you spoke at Ratio Christi on this topic, and I just thought it was very fascinating. So so I reached out to you, and you said you did this as your dissertation at SES?
Yes. What happened is that when I was working on my doctorate, I had to come up with a topic.
That's right.
And I was having a hard time coming up with something. Mm-hmm. So I went to a Juneteenth celebration here in Charlotte. And for those of you who don't know, Juneteenth is a celebration the African Americans have to celebrate the abolition of slavery. Now, it was formally already abolished by the what's that document?
Emancipation.
There you go. But there were slave owners who weren't giving in so easily. It celebrates the day that the slaves were actually physically freed. Mm-hmm. And so I was down there watching. They had music, they had food, and it was a general good time. It was hot, but it was generally a good time. I was really enjoying myself. And then I saw this picture, and they say picture's worth 1,000 words. So I saw this picture, and it stopped me in my tracks. It was a picture of a little black baby, and the black baby was being fed by a giant spoon. And the spoon was being held by a white hand. And in the spoon was a Bible, the cross, and chains. Mm-hmm. So it was clear to me, the implication there, or the message they were trying to communicate there, is that Christianity is a slave religion. Now, I had known enough apologetics to know that that was not the truth, to know that that was wrong. So I decided to create my dissertation based around that, called The African American Guide to the Bible, where I deal with those type of issues. I talk about the Bible and slavery, and I talk about all the arguments that have been used to prove that Black people are inferior, that God is racist. I talk about the Black presence in the Bible. Who were the people in the Bible? They weren't these European people that we so often hear about. Jesus was not blind, they had blue eyes. And so I talk about all that type of stuff. And I finish up talking about the actual nature or the actual God's view of man and the unity of man from his perspective, that we are all one, that there's no such thing as race in the Bible. Race is not even a biblical concept. Race was invented by man in our recent history. So that in a nutshell is how I came to write that book.
That's awesome. Yeah, so when I heard you speak at Winthrop a couple years ago on this topic, it was very interesting because I heard this a lot in Kenya about 9-10 years ago when I lived there, that Christianity is a white man's religion. And it's funny because I had never thought about the issue of race until I moved to the US from Brazil. I was in middle school, so, as a kid, that was like, it was major culture shock, how everything's about race. And I think throughout the years, I've just adapted that mentality too. And so when you talked about how race isn't in the Bible and how it's a social construct, to me, I was like, oh, that makes sense. And I don't know, it's just, it's a cool thought. It's not a biblical concept. Ethnicity is, but not race. And
exactly. God dealt with nations. He dealt with the Jews. He dealt with the Hittites and the Jebusites and the Amorites. That's how he dealt with people. He didn't deal with people by the color of their skin. And that wouldn't even make any sense to people then. And that becomes an issue. And I deal about this in my book, is because what has happened is that people look at the pages of scripture and they read race into it.
Really?
When race is not even a biblical concept. For some reason, they look at the Old Testament. They see Jews and they see Jews captivating the people around them. And they automatically assume that the Jews were white and these people were black.
Oh, wow. That makes...
So that's why we have that. When that is not true. That's one of the things I talk about in my book, is that the Jews were not white. They were pretty much all the same skin color, the same tone. There was no such concept as race. And the idea that these Jews were mistreating these slaves, first of all, if we want to really look at that, we have to look at the fact that the Jews were in captivity. They went into slavery a number of times. They went into slavery at the hands of the Babylonians, who come from Canaan, or the father, or Ham, that fathered the African nations, as well as Assyria. The Assyrian Empire was founded by, oh my goodness, what is his name? I talk about the mighty warrior before the Lord. So these are like nations of African descent enslaving the Jews. So that in and of itself dispels that complete argument.
Yeah, I mean, they were slaves in Egypt, right?
They were slaves in Egypt for 400 years. That's another point that people tend to forget. Whenever you read about, first of all, the word slavery.
Yes, this is fascinating.
Slave was actually a word that didn't even exist until like the 900s, when the Muslims took the Slavic people slaves. That's where the term comes from. So the term slave didn't even exist when the Bible was translated, or definitely when it was written.
So that was in Spain? Well, modern day Spain? Okay.
Well, yes.
Okay.
Well, Slavic people. The modern day, but the Spaniards were both slaves and slave owners.
True.
They did both.
That is so, honestly, that blew my mind. I've heard about the Arab slave trade in general, but just, not all these groups. Okay.
Every major religion has practiced slavery. Every major nation has been involved in slavery. Slavery is when a stronger nation enslaves a weaker nation. It's happened on every continent. Russians were slaves and taking people's slaves. In Africa, one of the things that people don't seem to get is that white people didn't go to Africa and start enslaving people like you see on Roots. That didn't happen. It was strong African nations enslaving weaker African nations and selling those slaves to the Europeans who came and bought them. So, but here's the crux of it. And this is one of the things I really try to stress, is that the point I'm trying to make when I talk about Christianity and slavery, the end point that I'm trying to make is that slavery was an accepted institution by man from the beginning of time, and that everyone engaged in it. It was not even seen as an issue. It was not seen as an issue until Christianity came along and made it an issue. because Christianity came along and decided, and made the case that slavery is wrong because people are made in the image of God. It is under the Christian worldview that made slavery a problem. Slavery wasn't a problem under Buddhism, under Hinduism, definitely under Islam, clearly not under atheism. It was only under Christianity that made it an issue. So now we look back at slavery and we see it as a horrible institution, which it was, but we are reading into it our understanding of slavery now and putting that image on them, people who were doing it hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago. We are holding them to a standard that did not exist in their time.
Gotcha.
The standard only exists because of Christianity.
Wow, it's fascinating. Yeah. So I was going to ask, like, okay, when I think of the abolition of slavery, I always think of like the movie Amazing Grace. I think of William Wilberforce. I think of Harriet Tubman, how her faith was, so like, yeah, it's just hard to talk about her without talking about her faith. And then of course the Quakers. But so like, why do you think it's important to see how Christianity set the foundation for the abolition of slavery worldwide? Like, can you talk about, like, in Apologetics, like what comes up like with this whole, could you just tell us more about the problem and before we delve into this topic?
So the problem is that a lot of people blacks have been convinced that Christianity is the white man's religion, that Christianity is responsible for enslaving people. I've heard some people even say that Christianity was invented for the sole purpose of enslaving black people. And the exact opposite is true. It is the foundation of the Christian understanding of man being made in the image of God that set the tone for the abolitionist movement. It is that idea that first provoked the Quakers to say, no more. We are not going to allow anyone who is a Quaker to own slaves. And for that to catch fire in the British government. And for that fire to not only did that fire start to the point where it raised up the abolitionist movement and abolished slavery in Britain or the UK, but that also translated to the rest of the world because Britain, once they didn't just stop with abolishing slavery. They didn't just stop there. They set out on a worldwide mission to abolish slavery worldwide, all based on that idea of man being made in the image of God. So now you have the British government, which had the most superior naval force, were now imposing their will on other nations. They were actually blockaded. They actually blockaded the Ottoman Empire because until they decided to give up slavery. They were going to Africa and they were boarding ships. They were sinking ships that they suspected were involved in the slave trade.
In Brazil, right?
Yeah, in Brazil as well. They were actually not doing trade with nations that still were involved in the slave trade. They were using their economic and military power to impose that non-slavery on other nations. And then other nations in Europe caught on and joined alongside Britain. And then eventually America did as well. But here's the thing, for instance, that people don't understand, is that even when slavery was abolished here in the United States, it was still going on in other places of the world. There was still slavery going on in Egypt. Egypt was still practicing slavery. Right. They were still practicing slavery, still selling slaves on the auction block long after slavery was dealt away with in the United States. And I'll go a step further. There's still some slavery in pockets now. There are Christians who are being held as slaves by Muslims in certain parts of Africa right now. And I know because there are ministries involved in doing that. I actually paid for the release of one slave myself out of my pocket.
Wow.
So, but the whole idea, let's say, slavery had always existed. Slavery has always existed from the beginning of time. And we have this idea of slavery being, these white people against these black people, but black people enslaved black people, Native Americans before the first European came to the United States Native Americans were enslaving other Native Americans. As a matter of fact, when the Europeans came, some of the tribes approached the Europeans and said, "Will you help us fight and enslave those people? Because those are our enemies." Because at that point, the Europeans weren't their enemies, but these are people who have been fighting and enslaving each other for thousands of years before they saw a white man. Mm-hmm. So, and in Africa, as a matter of fact, like I said, there was Africans enslaving Africans, weaker nations being enslaved by stronger nations. And one of the things that stopped the slave trade from growing or pretty much snuffed it out was the colonization in Africa. Because now you didn't have the tribes fighting over each other and enslaving one another once we came over colonial rule. So I think we have a very warped understanding of slavery. We think about slavery and all we think about is the antebellum South. Slavery has been an institution, a world institution since
Oops. Let me see. Harold, can you hear me? I think we may be having some technical issues here. He is back. Let me see here. Awesome. Yay! I can see his face.
All right.
I can hear him. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yes.
That was like the granddaddy of all technical difficulties.
I know, right? And look, we still have 5 people with us. So thank you guys for your patience. And
those are patient people.
Very patient people. So, all right, where should we pick back up? I'll let you decide.
Where did we leave off?
We were talking about ancient times. Should we skip ahead to modern times?
Well, I remember talking about Native Americans, and I remember talking about Africans, enslaving Africans. Now, one of the things that sort of bothered me as I was doing my research, and that is there was a movie that sort of really, shaped my life, and I sort of touched on it already when I was growing up, and that was the movie Roots. Mm-hmm. It had a pronounced impact on me, especially the beginning part where the Europeans came in and captured Africans and took them back to Africa. Mm-hmm. And then upon doing my research, I found out, well, first of all, that the story was plagiarized by Alex Haley from a work of fiction written by a white guy. Mm-hmm. So that stuff didn't even happen. As I mentioned before, when they came to Africa, they bought them from tribal leaders who had taken them as slaves themselves. Hmm. And so that sort of like painted my picture and a lot of pictures of a lot of people in America, particularly in the Black community, about what slavery was. Hmm. But the part that really was never told is that as horrible as that was, and that was horrible, when we even just going over and buying slaves and bringing them back, the part that I sort of find fascinating is that Islam somehow becomes the religion of Black people. When Islam was as much, if not more, invested in slavery than Christians were. Now, I want to say this out front. There were Christians who were slave owners. There were, no doubt about it. But there were also people from every other religion who were slave owners as well. Now, although we had millions of people, I think by some estimates, 10 million of people who were brought over through the Middle Passage across the Atlantic as slaves from Africa, there were approximately 14 million who were taken to Muslim nations. And they were, for the most part, they were trampled across the Sahara Desert. And there was even a higher mortality rate. There were more of those who died on the trip across the Sahara Desert than died on the ships coming to America.
Wow. You don't hear about that hardly.
You do not hear about that. And they were very, very invested in the slave trade. As a matter of fact, they were one of the last holdouts when it came to abolishing slavery, because they felt that it was endorsed by Muhammad. They felt that it had become a part of Ottoman kingdom. When the British first wrote the letter to the Ottoman Empire, to the Sultan, saying, we want y'all to give up slavery, they laughed. They were like, oh, you gotta be kidding. Why? Why would anyone give up slavery? Because they were just as invested, if not more invested. When slavery had been outlawed here in the United States, they were still practicing slavery wholeheartedly in the Ottoman Empire. So the idea that some people use Islam as a replacement for Christianity, because Christianity is a slave religion, whereas Islam was even more invested, and Christianity was actually responsible for the abolition of slavery, it boggles my mind. I get a little passionate when I talk about this.
That is, so crazy. Yeah.
Why go to Islam? Like I say, all religions, all major religions practice slavery. All nations practice slavery. Buddhism, we have Hinduism, we have the whole caste system built inside of the religion. So although Christians practiced slavery, they weren't alone. And they were responsible for the abolition of slavery because of the idea of man being made in the image of God. Only under the Christian worldview was slavery incompatible. Slavery is not incompatible with Islam. It's not incompatible with Hinduism. It's not incompatible with atheism. Islam, because they don't have the idea of man being made in the image of God. That is what made it incompatible with Christianity. So the idea that Christianity is compatible with slavery, or that Christianity promotes slavery, is it's like, and I'm in the twilight zone when I hear people say that.
Yeah. Huh. So, going back to like Islam, Nation of Islam and all, there's a question here. I thought, I didn't really know. About the term African American. I know you mentioned it briefly at the beginning of one of your books, but you don't talk about, do you know the origin?
Well, okay, so I sort of mentioned this in my book.
Yeah, you talk about Diana and Simon in there.
Yes, yes.
Some of our
I use the term because that is what we have called ourselves popularly. But the term really is not a good term, because African American doesn't really describe a lot of the people who are considered African Americans. And we talked about, like, in my book, I talk about the fact that I have a friend who works at SCS right now, Diana. She is from Canada, but she's Black. So people will look at her and say she's African American. No, she's not. She's Canadian American. She's not. And then I have a friend, Simon, who's actually a white guy who's from Africa, South African. So he actually is an African American. So I prefer the term Black American because that is more actually reflective of who we are. But I think the term was, if I'm not wrong, I think this was the term sort of coined by like Reverend Jesse Jackson.
Really?
And it sort of just took on, it was accepted by Black people and adopted by Black people, but I think the term is not very descriptive. And even though I call my book The African American Guide to the Bible, I also put a disclaimer in there.
Yeah, I saw that. I like that example. Yeah. Cool. So another great question is, in the Black community, is slavery or racism associated more closely with white people or with Christianity?
That is a good question. It is associated with both, but I would probably say white people more so. And the only reason I would say that is because there are a lot of Black Christians. So there are a lot of Black Christians, so they wouldn't consider themselves being associated with slavery. So I would say more so with white people. But, white people were, the first white people to come to Africa came as slaves. White people were enslaving white people. As a matter of fact, whites were enslaving whites until a lot of the European nations became Christianized. And then that's when they turned their sights to Africa, because they were enslaving each other before that.
Oh, wow.
And the reason why they turned their sights to Africa is because what you got to do is you got to dehumanize someone before you can actually enslave them, because especially when you understand that man is made in the image of God. So what you do is you convince yourself that they're not made in the image of God. You convince yourself that they're less than human. And because they are way over there, and because they look differently, it made it easier to dehumanize them. As a matter of fact, there were a lot of missionaries who would not go to Africa to become missionaries because they didn't consider themselves human. They didn't consider the Africans human and didn't consider them to have souls.
Wow.
So yeah, this is a topic that sort of, and the interesting thing is I really was sort of hesitant on this topic because it wasn't something I was initially passionate about. I did it because I had to do a dissertation.
Yeah.
But people are reaching out to me over this topic.
Yeah, I bet.
Because it becomes becoming such a big topic that I just sort of like got pulled into it. and another thing I want to mention that I talk about in my book is that I talk about Christianity being a white man's religion. What we have to realize is that the majority of Christians are not in America. The majority, matter of fact, there are by some estimates 200 million Christians in China.
That's crazy.
More Christians in China than in America. There are, I could take 10 nations, and I actually do this in my book. 10 nations in Africa have more Christians than in the United States. So most Christians are not even white. So that further puts a nail in the coffin of the idea that Christianity is a white man's religion. And when we look at the origins of Christianity, it was never a white man's religion. Let's look at Pentecost. Who was present at Pentecost? And for those of you who don't know, Pentecost is when the church actually began. And when you look at who was present at Pentecost, there were 3,000 converts. If you look at the Jews who were present, they were from every nation, pretty much all the nations of the earth. They were from Africa. There were Christians there from Africa. So when the church first took its roots, in the first beginning infancy stages of Christianity, the original church were people from church who were all over the world, including people from Africa. When we look at what God did, the first Gentile, the first non-Jew convert to Christianity was the Ethiopian eunuch.
Yeah, exactly.
And God performed a miracle to make that happen. What a lot of people don't realize is that the Ethiopian eunuch, that exact same Ethiopian eunuch, took Christianity back to his queen Candace of Ethiopia, and she became a believer.
That's awesome.
And by the 4th century AD, pretty much all of Africa was Christianized. Africa was a Christian nation before it even took a foothold in Europe. So the idea, that's another idea I had to deal with. The idea that Christians, missionaries brought Christianity to Africa through these white missionaries is not true, because Christianity was thriving in Africa before it was thriving in Europe.
Yeah, exactly.
And a lot of the first Christians, a lot of the first theologians who were codifying the Christian doctrine were African. The first seminary was in Africa. And when you look at some of the first heroes of the faith, the first models of the faith, they were African. We know this because we know who some of them were. And we also know that there were New Testament documents, New Testament manuscripts written in Coptic, written in language that's specifically African. So, as a matter of fact, Africa was one of the few places in the world that were not Christianized as a result of Roman influence. So they embraced Christianity before Christianity was popular. The very root of Christianity is African. So that further dispels the notion that Christianity is a white man's religion. It wasn't in the beginning. It isn't now.
Yes. Oh, welcome, Kevin. We have him joining us.
Hey,
He's
Kevin.
a Kenyan apologist, and yeah, he actually recommended your book in one of his blogs, and it made me
All
think,
right.
like, I need to have Harold on the show.
I
So,
appreciate that. I
yeah,
appreciate that.
he has a really interesting, perspective too. He lives in Nairobi, Kenya, and there was a question here I was looking for. There's so many comments here, and which is awesome.
I'm
So
not, not surprised.
I think this was the next question that popped up. So, do you think that practicing Kemet is the reason for a big push to declare that Christianity is a white man's religion?
Okay,
In the U.S.,
I'm not
possibly.
familiar with Kemet. I'm not
I'm not
familiar
very. I've just heard
So-
about it. Like I know other YouTubers have addressed. I haven't researched it much. So, if Thomas, if you want to share more, that would be awesome. So we can, have more an idea how to. Yeah, we already addressed this one. I think we don't know exactly. Yeah, if it's Thomas or Malcolm X. Thomas says, "What is the earliest record of Christianity in Africa, and does it predate Islam, which started in the 7th century?"
Oh,
I mean,
way before 7th century.
first century, right? The Ethiopian eunuch, and
Right.
a
Right.
lot of the early
And-
church fathers in the 2nd century,
Right.
3rd century.
Right. And I mentioned also that we have New Testaments of the manuscript going back to 200 AD that are written in Coptic and in African, and specifically African languages. We have uncovered churches that are African, that have depictions of New Testament scenes that were built around the 1st, 2nd century AD. So yes, actually, this was way before Muhammad and the 6th century. The Christianity, and I mentioned that by the 4th century AD, Christianity was pretty much the religion of Africa. The continent of Africa was pretty much Christianized by 4th century AD. Now, it only changed at the time due to trade and gradual attrition. It became, in pockets more Muslim, but initially it was Christian.
Mm-hmm.
And definitely predating Islam.
Awesome.
Hopefully I answered that question.
Yeah, it's great. When they say the white man's religion, are they talking about the birth of the Catholic Church in Rome in the 4th century? I mean, some people kind of think that's when Christianity began. I mean, I've heard that, obviously. I don't think there's much evidence for that, but I mean, they just think of Constantine. They associate Constantine with Christianity. But
when I hear it from other African Americans, to me, they're talking about slavery being Christianity being forced on slaves who will come to this country, or that even today that Christianity is associated with white people, which is why I go through great lengths to dispel that. And I sort of just did that when I was talking about the fact that it wasn't white in the beginning and it's not white now. When I talk about the fact that demographically, the majority of Christians are not white. They're not Anglo. They're not European. So I think that's what most people talk about when they talk about the now. Because even when, and I think this whole notion that Jesus was this blonde-haired, blue-eyed person, I think sort of perpetuates that. And I think a lot of people who are Black see this blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus, and they say, well, this is clearly a white man's religion. They have a white God. They pray to a white God. Matter of fact, I quote in my book Malcolm X saying that. Basically, they worship this this blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus who don't look nothing like us. When the fact of the matter is, those depictions of Jesus are just incorrect. They are just wrong. Jesus was Semitic. And one of the things I point out in my book is that skin tone is determined by geography. So you can look at a map of the world and you could pretty much determine the skin tone of people by where they are geographically. Of course, the closer to the equator, the darker the skin. And the further away from the equator, then the lighter the skin. And I even talk about how that came about. I talk about the fact that that both biblically and scientifically, the case is that life began in Africa. That even, and I go to the fact that even the Garden of Eden was in Africa. So as people migrate out, Then we have what we call microevolution. And I want to make sure I differentiate microevolution from macroevolution. Microevolution is the changes within the species to better adapt to the environment. Macroevolution is the change from one species to another, which has never been demonstrated, has never been proven, has never been observed. But people do. So what happens is as people moved further north, they became lighter because people who became lighter were able to absorb more of the sun rays and get the vitamin D that they needed. They became healthier. They had more children, and those children that were lighter, that had that trait, produced more children who were lighter, and so on and so. The way I look at it, the way I this is a very general oversimplification, but I look at it as far as, like, for instance, the way dogs are. You can breed dogs. All dogs come from wolves, but you can make them look different. But as they move further away from their genesis, then they lose some of their genetic material. So you could go from a wolf to a poodle, but you could never go from a poodle back to a wolf. So God built in us the ability to be able to adapt to our environment. Those who are further south, because of the skin tone, block out some of the rays. So people who are darker skin tend to reproduce, be healthier, and all that type of stuff. So now here's a problem I have, y'all. I gotta tell y'all this. I gotta be honest with y'all. I go on rabbit trails and I forget how I got down there. So I went down this rabbit trail. I forgot where I was
Rome?
at.
We're talking about the Catholic Church in Rome,
Oh yeah,
4th century.
yeah. Oh yeah. So yeah, the church definitely became Romanized. It definitely lost some of its Jewish ethnicity and lost a lot of its African roots when the Roman Church came to power. There's no doubt about that.
Gotcha.
But when I hear white man's religion, generally talking about the fact today that Christianity is white and that Jesus is white. That's where I was at. Yeah. I was talking about Jesus being white, and that is not true. So you look geographically, you'll look and see that the people there are not European white. Mm-hmm. And so neither was Jesus, because Jesus was a Jew. Jews come from Abraham. Abraham was from Ur, which is like modern day Iraq. We know for also that the Jews were in Africa and in Egypt for 400 years. We know that during that time, I know I'm getting a little sidetracked, but I think we got the time.
Yeah, that's fine.
During that time that they were in Africa is also when the time that there was a great influx of Cushites who migrated up to Egypt. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the term Cushites are what we would call the Black Africans, and it makes up today what we would say is Sudan, Ethiopia, okay, and I think Southern Egypt. And it was during that time, and there's no doubt in my mind they were intermingling with them because they did it when God told them not to, but it had nothing to do with race. But during this time we know that they did, and one of the reasons we know that they did is because we know that Moses himself married a Cushite. Mm-hmm. He married an Ethiopian woman. That was probably a common practice. And when they left Egypt, they came up out of Egypt as a mixed multitude. Mm-hmm. They had been, it wasn't just the Jews. It was like they were Egyptians, they were Cushites. There was some of everything that were intermingled with them and just came up out of Egypt with them. So it wasn't this these white Europeans who were coming out of Egypt. That wasn't the case because they weren't European. And add on to that the fact that two of the tribes were African. So we look at the story of Joseph, who married an Egyptian priestess. They had two children, Manasseh and Ephraim, who were born to the Egyptian woman. These became two of the tribes of Israel. So two of the tribes were African. Yeah. So this idea that these were these white Europeans, that these Jews were, is just not biblically supported.
Yeah, for sure. Huh. Very interesting. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Great. So what are some of the similarities and differences between slavery around the world versus slavery in our country?
Okay. So yeah, this is an interesting topic. Now, I'll say the main difference with slavery in America is that it was pretty much race-based.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as how the slaves were treated, it varied around the world. There were places where they were treated better. There were places where they were not treated as well. And it depended on sometimes the kind of slavery. Now, give you an example. In Islam, a lot of the slaves were domestic help. They didn't have like a bunch of plantations and stuff. A lot of those may have been treated better because they were in the household. And when you have, and it was even true in the South of the slaves who were in the household, you tend to treat them differently because they're around your family. And you tend to have slaves who were a greater asset. So, but here's an interesting thing. Here's an interesting thing. Is that even in the antebellum South, there were a significant portion of free blacks who had slaves. And they did not treat their slaves any differently than the whites treated the slaves in the antebellum South. Now, before we get so upset with them, let's keep in mind that we're talking about the antebellum South. As a matter of fact, 77%, and I talk about this in my book, 77% of free blacks owned slaves. But keep in mind that one of the driving forces behind that is if you were a freeman, if you were a free slave, and people became free for various reasons. Some they may have bought their freedom. Some, the master may have given them freedom. But you become an entrepreneur. You start a barbershop. You start a hotel. You start a restaurant. Where are you going to get your labor from? White people ain't going to work for you. Not in antebellum South. Free blacks probably weren't going to work for you either. Your only option really was to have other slaves.
Gotcha.
So a lot of and depending on who those slaves were, those who were on the plantation were generally treated worse than those who were, for instance, in barbershops or in restaurants. In a lot of the cities, in a lot of the urban areas, slaves were actually, depending on the skills they had, in a lot of instances, in a lot of ways, they operated like freemen. They could even choose who their master was. So for them, slavery looked a lot different than it looked for the slave who was on the plantation. And in different parts of the world, it may have looked different. Sometimes it was better, sometimes it was worse. It depended on the specific situation of the slaves. In the Caribbean, it may have been worse, depending on where in the Caribbean. There are some places in the Caribbean where slaves were treated a lot worse, and there were other parts of the Caribbean where they were treated better because they were more domestic help than they were plantation slaves. And keep in mind also that a lot of the slave owners, especially when it came to the plantation, a lot of the slaves the plantation were run by overseers, and a lot of the owners were vacant. What do you call it? I don't call them vacant, but absent owners. And so it was the responsibility of the overseer to get as much work out of them as they could. But also keep in mind also that these slaves were considered valuable commodities. So if there were situations where if the work was really dangerous, they would hire a white person to do it because the slave was valuable property and they didn't want their slaves getting hurt. So slavery is a real complicated subject. If you really want to know more about it, I would recommend you read a book by called Race and Culture by a guy named Thomas Sowell. That was actually his.
What's his last name? Orwell? He's from Gastonia. Sowell.
Yes, this is a guy from Gastonia. He was actually born in Gastonia. But he actually has a whole chapter that he deals with slavery. And he's actually a scholar. He has all those accolades. Harvard and Princeton and think tanks. But the interesting thing about him is that he's actually an African American. And so he goes into a lot of that. He talks about that a lot. And he gives you a lot of details. As a matter of fact, what I'm going to start doing is reading. I read his stuff. But what I like to do is when I'm researching something is I read the people that the researchers quote and they read their stuff.
Yeah,
So,
that's good.
yeah,
Primary sources,
that's
right?
how you learn. That's how you learn.
Exactly. Awesome. Yeah. So here, Thomas was telling us Kemet. I guess it's the Egyptian religion. I guess it's connected to Kemetic orthodoxy. So yeah, I
Okay.
definitely need to look into that.
Yeah.
So when did slavery become so closely associated with race?
Okay.
That mean the last 100, 200 years? What would you say?
Okay. So, and this is in Islam. Islam was racist as well, but racism actually was a result of slavery. So they had the slaves, and then as a result of that, then racism grew out of that.
Okay.
And sort of the same thing here is that once there were slaves, then racism sort of grew out of that to reinforce that slavery, to reinforce. Okay, let me give you a little bit of history. So initially in America, we had what you call indentured servants. So these were people who were coming from Europe, and they were working 7 years to pay off their passage to America, and then they could go free.
Okay.
So you had people coming from Europe who were all kinds of background: Irish, German, Africans. I mean,
Africans? Wow.
Well, not Africans, black. I guess that's more of
okay.
So they all worked together. They were all out in the fields together because the idea of race hadn't really happened yet.
Okay.
There was an event that took place that changed that. And it was called Bacon's Rebellion. So in Bacon's Rebellion, the people who were the landowner classes, there was an uprising against them by the people who were the workers in the plantation, the field hands. Now, the people in these field hands, like I said, they were all different types of races, colors. Because race back then actually meant like nationality. Irish was a race, German was a race.
Gotcha.
It wasn't until later that race became the color of your skin.
Okay.
So then they did this rebellion, and it was a big deal. I mean, it was a big deal. And the landowners, because right now there was no black nor white. There was the landowners, and then there were the people who weren't landowners. And the landowners were, they were white, but they were the only people who were white. Irish weren't white. Germans weren't white. So after Bacon's rebellion, the slave owners, the landowners decided that they were going to divide and conquer. And the way that they did that was by basically creating race, inventing blackness. Now, what was fascinating about this is that they used two sources to do that: the Bible and science. They used the Bible by saying things like God endorsing slavery, saying things like the curse of Cain was God cursing black people. And I deal with all this in my book. You have to really do some serious scriptural gymnastics to justify slavery in the Bible. And the other was science, because now you had the theory of evolution, and you had the theory that some people are more equal than other people. So they decided to now make race the deciding factor of who's going to be a slave. Ooh. Here is a side note that I think y'all going to find very interesting. Now, up until this point, like slaves were indentured servants. And after 7 years, then, there was a case. They changed all that. There was a case where a slave owner sued a slave owner, because the slave owner was making the slave a slave for life. Okay. Right. Now, the courts ruled that the slave owner had the right to make the slave a slave for life. That opened up the door. But what's fascinating about that case is that both the slave owner and the slave were both black.
What?
Yeah.
I hadn't heard that. Wow.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. There's a lot of things that, that matter of fact, when I go and give my talks, people just look at me like,
You're
that's
making
why,
this up. Where are your slides?
that is why, if you look at my presentation, if you look at my PowerPoint, I'm quoting.
Mm-hmm.
Because if I just came out and said this stuff, people would be like, he's making that stuff up. I'm not making this stuff up, y'all. Okay, now, so I went down a rabbit hole. Oh, we were talking about race. All right. So then the landowners convinced the Irish, the Germans, and the others that if they were joined them in suppressing blacks, then they could be white.
The Germans? That's so weird to me because, like, I don't know. I always think blonde, blue eyes. Like, how can you get whiter than German? But okay.
Right. So they convinced those others that if you join us in suppressing black people, then we will give you the privilege of being white. So then blackness came about and whiteness came about. And so now, then that's when all the laws started coming in to start to suppress black people, to take away their votes, to take not just their votes, but take away their ability to like marry interracially and all that type of stuff. So the racism actually came after slavery. It does right.
Mm-hmm. Good. Awesome. So isn't there a strong presence of Catholics in Africa as well? I would say definitely. I lived in Kenya for a couple years. I don't know if Kevin is still in here too, if he wants to comment on that, and Dr. Felder too. I think we were talking. Oh, he had asked earlier about, the whole idea of white man's religion, and you're talking about like where the majority of the Christians are is not in the white. I mean,
it's not in America.
White areas. It's more Africa, South America.
Right.
There's definitely a Christianity in general in Africa. I'm not sure about Catholicism as such, but there definitely is. Yeah, there definitely are lots of Catholics in Africa too.
Yeah, I don't know the percentage of. I know the evangelicals are there. I know definitely Pentecostals are there.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure about the Catholic Church.
Mm-hmm. All right. So, would you care to comment on this verse, Ephesians 6:5? It's the one that talks about how we're supposed to be respectful. It's the one that addresses every single person in society, right? And tells them to be respectful.
Right.
Yeah, and this is a hard one. Is it servants? Yeah. Is it slaves? Like, what do you think they're addressing here?
And keep in mind, like I said, the word slave didn't even exist. The word slave didn't exist when the Bible was written. And keep in mind also that this is during the time when the Roman Empire was in power. And in the Roman Empire, 1 out of every 2 people were slaves.
Okay.
And slavery looked a lot different then.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in a lot of instances.
Okay.
So basically what he's saying, because, he's saying basically for you to obey, you to obey your master or your employer. And keep in mind also, and this is one of the things I harped on earlier, our understanding of slavery is tainted by what happened in antebellum South. Mm-hmm. Slavery existed long before what happened in antebellum South. Whenever we hear slavery, we automatically think of that, and we read that into scripture every time we see the word slave. Mm-hmm. Whereas here, basically, we're talking about people who are workers are supposed to obey the people that they work for. It is obedience to the people that you work for. That is the essence of that.
I also think
how they sometimes use the word slave and sometimes they use the word servant interchangeably. I don't know how they do that because the word slave didn't exist.
Okay. Yeah, I know in some translations it talks about us being servants of, like, I think Paul maybe addresses himself as a slave of Christ, and other translations says servant of Christ, and seems like depends which translation, like it gets translated differently, but
right.
Yeah.
Right, but that does not, this is no way it's condoning what we saw in Antebellum South. And keep in mind now that when we are talking about a time when slavery was common. Like I said, 1 or 2 people in the Roman Empire was common with slavery. So this is not a time when slavery was seen as an evil thing. Because slavery wasn't seen as an evil thing until Christianity took a root and sowed the seeds of the abolition of slavery. So to look back on these passages and read our understanding of slavery into them is disingenuous to the people back then.
When you were talking about like, I guess like white people going over to Africa, kidnapping people, I started thinking like the Bible definitely addresses kidnapping and how that's wrong, like in Deuteronomy 24. And so like, I mean, there's certain aspects of slavery that you can see, like it doesn't say thou shalt not have slaves and, in the antebellum South sense, but it obviously like it does address a lot of those issues.
Right. I mean, what principles?
Sorry. I didn't know if we were still... Okay, what principles in Christianity do you think were instrumental in the abolitionist movement? This is a very good question.
Actually, that is a very good question. And it is, and I think I sort of touched on it. I'm trying to get my light back on.
Being made.
It is the whole idea of man being made in the image of God. That Genesis we all 1. Come, right, that we all come from one man and one woman. Now, the genetic makeup of every person that is walking around today was in the DNA of Adam and Eve. And the fact that we are made in the image of God makes owning another person incompatible with the principle of Christianity. And that is the principle that sparked the abolitionist movement. And that is the principle that you will only find in Christianity that makes Christianity, out of all the other worldviews, that makes Christianity incompatible with slavery. That was a good question.
Yeah, very good. Awesome. So let me see if I had one more question here, I think. Let me see. So do you have any closing words as well? And then we'll see if you have any last few questions, you can put them in the chat box as well. This has been an awesome discussion.
So I would like to say this, because one of the things that I do in my book is I talk about how God does view people. Okay. And I talk about the fact that he does view them all as one. I want us to keep in mind that when God called Abraham out of Ur, and he told Abraham that all the nations of the world would be blessed by you. What God did was, although he set up Israel as being a nation of priests, he was looking at them to be priests toward the entire world. So God's salvation, when we read God's salvation, God talks about his salvation. He talks about the fact that it's going to be for the entire world. All the nations of the world will be blessed through you. We know that he was talking about Jesus. God, throughout the entire Old Testament, throughout the entire the prophets, throughout the Psalms, is always talking about the salvation of all the nations. And even during the time that Israel was a nation, one of the things Israel did every year was they sacrificed 70 bulls for the 70 nations. This included the nations of Cush. This included the African nations. And even we see in the New Testament, we see God's great commission. We see the new commission, or the great commission that Jesus gave. Go into all the parts of the world and make disciples. So he's talking about the furthest parts of the world. He even mentioned the furthest parts of the world. And at that time, Cush was considered the farthest parts of the world. So there are passages that talk about the entire world, but there are also passages that talk specifically about Egypt, that talk specifically about Cush, that God is calling these people to him as well. That message of salvation went to everyone, not to white people, not to black people, to everyone. Remember, the race is not a biblical concept because God is calling all people to himself. And I think the picture that we should make sure that we get in our heads is that when John the Revelator was looking at the people in heaven, when he was seeing the throne of God, when he was looking around, he said that there were people from all nations, every tribe, every tongue, worshiping. He didn't say there were white people over here and black people over there, or just black people. We were saying people from every nation, tribe, and tongue. They were all worshiping God. That is the idea of God. That is the idea that God had for all mankind. He sees us all because we all come from Adam and Eve. We all are made in his image. We all have the spark of divinity. So God, that is why racism is wrong. And that is why I am passionate about what I'm talking about now.
Yes. Amen. Yeah, I love how your book, The African American Guide to the Bible, you mentioned how like it's really a book for everyone because it's a message of unity. And you said, I heard in one of your talks, you mentioned a Caucasian pastor with I think a Caucasian congregation. He bought it for like a person in every single person in his church. And I just thought that was, so cool.
Yeah, I had people who are telling me all the time that they are buying it for other people, and it's encouraging. I mean, it's encouraging.
Yes. And do you want to mention your other books? You have 2 other books in the works, correct?
So I have one book that I finished.
Okay.
That I'm still trying to figure out how to get it published. And it's called Confessions of an Atheist. All right. So in this book is basically my testimony. But one of the things that I did do is that in order to bring apologetics to life, I did not want to just give propositional truths. So I actually portray myself as an atheist who has cried out to God for evidence to see whether or not Christianity was true. And then God answers by bringing an angel that engages in dialogue. So this angel is basically doing the apologetics. And so as an atheist, I'm asking all these questions that bothered me as an atheist. Like, why is there evil? If there's a loving God, what about the Bible? Why Jesus? What about people who never heard? What about, Christianity being a white man's religion? So I deal with all these issues as a dialogue between me and the angel to make it more alive.
That sounds awesome.
Yeah. And then the third book I'm writing, about 100 pages into it, is actually a whole book around the topic that we're doing now. Yeah. Christianity and slavery. And talking about, the abolition of slavery through Christianity, but also going into depth about how slavery was so pervasive before Christianity, every major religion practiced slavery, and how it was only Christianity that was the worldview of Christianity that made it incompatible with slavery.
Okay. Very cool. Yeah, definitely want to hear about that. I don't know a whole lot about like the abolition of slavery, like how everything went down in Brazil. Since I moved to the U.S. when I was in middle school, I probably know more about the U.S. and Brazil, but do you know much about South America, or do you address that in your book?
Well, South America is one of the places that the British government sort of coerced to give up slavery.
Because they went and they destroyed the slave ships in the Brazilian waters and other things as well.
Right. Okay. They were. It was really interesting. They were pretty. They were pretty ruthless in how they dealt with slavery. I mean, they would bribe government officials that they had to. They would, they would, like I said, they would do some underhanded slave tricks. They would confiscate ships and all kinds of things in order to get rid of slavery, in order to abolish slavery. And it is very ironic that, we hear that colonialism is such an evil thing, whereas colonialism had a big hand in the abolition of slavery.
That's so bizarre to me too.
It is. It is.
You said the Germans in East Africa would even like hang people who were like trading slaves or like something.
Yeah. And actually, there was one particular incident that sort of struck me. Really, sort of like, I guess, sort of brought it home for me that there was this one Muslim trade ship that was followed by a British ship that was going to board it and confiscate it. And before letting the British ship board and confiscate it, they cut the throat of every slave and threw them in the ocean.
Wow.
They killed each and every slave. They'd rather do that than to give up the slaves or to give up this ship. I think they still had to give up the ship, but to give up the slaves. Right. So that's how committed these people were to slavery.
Mm-hmm. It's crazy.
So there are a number of stories like that that are very...
So it's actually still human trafficking month. And so it's hard for me not to think about human trafficking, but I know someone locally who he talks about how, like, God, he helped, through God's people, and, like, slavery was abolished here in our country, but of course human trafficking is still going on. But we need to keep praying that, that eventually will come to an end as well. And
the slavery that's still going on in parts of Africa right now.
So many
where Muslims are taking Christians as slaves.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
We don't hear much about that because that's not, I guess, politically.
I know some YouTubers try to talk about it, and like sometimes it gets flagged, and like they see it as hate speech because you're like hating on Muslims if they're happening in Muslim countries.
Right. But political correctness, run them up. Right.
I know exactly.
Which is one of the reasons why the things that I say to people are shocking. Because the alternative, my view, the view that's not the mainstream view, is being silenced.
Yeah, so true.
That's why this stuff is so, when people are like, I never heard that before. That's why I speak about it all the time. I get invited places all the time, and I speak about it because I'm trying to get the word out as much as I can, because history has been rewritten to promote a lie. Gotcha.
So sad. Wow. Yeah. Thank you so much for taking so much time to come out and deal with all this technology. And yes, thank you so much.
Let me say something about that.
Yeah.
we definitely had our technological issues today. but when I was doing, because I have a YouTube channel, Giving an Answer.
Oh yeah, and I'm gonna tell them. Definitely subscribe.
So I did my show back when it was like old school. Like you had to go into the studio and stuff. You had to actually like have people like with cameras, and you had to have like a director and all that kind of stuff. So it's good to see technology come a long way.
Yes. And can you tell me what was the name of your channel? Giving an Answer, right? The name of your ministry?
The name of my ministry is Giving an Answer. I have a YouTube channel because what I did was I had a show, and I put all this, well, for the most part, all the shows up on my YouTube channel. Also have a website, givingananswer.org. You can check that out as well.
Very cool.
And that's my ministry.
Okay. Very cool. All right. Well, thank you so much, guys, for coming, and thank you so much, Dr. Felder, for your insights. And may God keep blessing you and using you. And yeah, and you're welcome to come back and talk about another topic or another book if you would like. That would be awesome.
Okay.
So yeah. All right. No, we've got it down now. Maybe we can even do some slides next time so everyone knows you're telling the truth. And
if you go to my website, to resources on my website, I actually have my slides.
Oh, okay.
You can actually download them.
Awesome. Yeah, and I know you have some videos with your slides here on YouTube as well.
And on my YouTube channel, you can see videos of me giving the talk on slavery and Christianity.
All right. Well, people love this. You can see in the comments, everyone's, we're really blessed. So, all right. And I'll see you guys next week. I'm going to be doing a talk on, it's going to be with a Brazilian missionary. And we're going to be addressing, some interesting philosophical topics about, I guess, the will and the mind, and hopefully we'll do one in English as well too. And Matt Graham, I haven't told you, Dr. Felder, Matt Graham and I may do something at some point about the philosophical underpinnings of critical theory. So I don't know a whole lot about that myself. Have you studied that much? You should.
I have, but I don't remember much.
Epistemology? What? That was quite the class. But I think it will be interesting. And
I think it will be as well.
Matt has been studying that. So, It'll be fun. All right. Well, thank you so much. I'll go ahead and end the broadcast here, and yeah, then we can chat. All right. Thanks everyone for coming. Take care. Bye.